all of you for having me. The premise of my talk is that jokes about the Holocaust, Holocaust humor in general, has grown exponentially in the past decade, particularly since the events of 9/11. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is in a few minutes. My research has been focused primarily on Holocaust studies, but over the past couple of years, I had started to make a transition to studies regarding 9/11, regarding terrorism, and regarding all sorts of lighter issues. That is, issues that are lighter than the Holocaust. But then one day, I didn't have very much to do, so I decided to watch television, and it just so happened that when I turned on the television, what I saw was the 2010 Comedy Central roast of David Hasselhoff. I was shocked to see, or to hear rather, that nearly every comedian who came up to the dais to roast David Hasselhoff had a joke about the Holocaust. And just to give you a little bit of insight into what I heard, a good friend of mine, an up-and-coming comedian named Zach Sherwin, is here, and he is going to read the 3 jokes. So the first joke you're going to hear Zach read is a joke told by none other than comedian Jeffrey Ross, the roast master.
Finally, a Jew gets to roast a German. Heil Hasselhoff. These were told on TV in a comedic setting already, you guys. It's okay to... The only difference between Hasselhoff and Hitler, at least Hitler knew when his career was over. Hoff, why did the Germans love you so much, huh? Maybe it's because you fill the entertainment void left by Anne Frank. Oh, too soon? That was Jeffrey Ross who said that. No.
Thank you, Jeffrey Ross. The next joke, many of the jokes caught my attention, but the next joke that really caught my attention was a joke by none other than Lisa Lampanelli, not a Jew.
As Seth MacFarlane said, David, your singing is huge in Germany. If they had played your music at Auschwitz, the Jews would have sprinted for those ovens.
And finally, none other than the very controversial former employee of Aflac, Gilbert Gottfried.
You know, I've always heard that David Hasselhoff has sold millions in Germany. But like a lot of stories out of Germany, those numbers are probably inflated, if not a complete hoax.
Thank you, Zach Sherwin. Okay, so that's just a very small sampling of some of the egregious or hilarious, depending on your perspective, jokes that I heard on the roast. But it got me thinking. I was shocked at the pervasiveness of the Holocaust as, comedic fodder. But I started to realize that everyone's doing it. It's not just something that was happening on the roast. And I started to realize that this is one of the most pervasive cultural phenomena, perhaps, that we have seen in the past decade. South Park does it. Sarah Silverman does it. Curb Your Enthusiasm in 2004. Ever remember the episode called The Survivor, right? Guy on the left there, Larry David has a dinner party. Guy on the left was a reality TV show star. He was on the show The Survivor. The guy sitting across from him is a Holocaust survivor. So you can imagine the ensuing debate about who is the greatest survivor. The guy who slept in a sleeping bag and had no snacks, or the guy in a concentration camp? You be the judge. Seinfeld, remember 1994? Okay, this is before 9/11, but it's still funny. Jerry and his girlfriend make out in a movie theater during Schindler's List, right? Everyone remembers this? Then there was The Producers, 1968, the first film by Mel Brooks, and then 1995, he decides to revive it. And one of my most recent favorites, After Lately, a 30-minute scripted sitcom on E! That takes place in the offices of Chelsea Handler.
What's up, Chu? What do you want to talk about?
You went to college, right?
Yes, I went to college, yes.
And you have your MBA, right?
My NBA?
Your MBA.
No, MBA is a master's degree.
Okay, whatever. My cousin Paco told me that I should ask for more perks. like in the show Entourage.
You watch Entourage?
Sometimes I do, yeah.
Yeah, you like that show?
Yeah.
Really? I think it's a dumb show.
Well, everybody have different tastes. Let's move on.
Okay. So, how does that affect me?
Like I said before, you went to college and you're a Jew, so
What does being Jewish have to do with it?
because you know a lot about business,
You're really playing up this Jew thing with me.
because you're good at it.
I'm
'Cause
good
we've
at
been
being
friends
a
for like
Jew.
that, maybe you want
oh, well,
to
you're
help
good
me.
at being a little Mexican. I mean, what does that mean?
See, now you're getting very racist.
Oh, I'm getting racist. Oh, because they're positive stereotypes about me, then
Positive stereotypes?
yeah. So because you think it's
Oh.
Jews are good with money, that's a positive thing. So you're allowed to say it, but I'm not allowed to call you a little Mexican.
Just let it go. The Holocaust was a long time ago. Okay?
The Holocaust was a long time ago. Okay, so as you can see, this is just a very small sampling of the very, very, very pervasive phenomena of Holocaust humor. But I got to thinking, why is it everywhere? Why the Holocaust? Why now? And then I think a number of you will probably, well, maybe not, will remember that the Danish filmmaker, Lars von Trier, right, the Cannes Film Festival, he made a joke about the Holocaust, about being Jewish. He said, for years, I was content to believe that I was Jewish, and then one day I found out that my family was German. I realized I was a Nazi, and I took a very bizarre kind of pleasure in this fact. And of course, it was very controversial, and of course, he refused to take it back. He said that would be very antithetical to my nature. So these jokes about the Holocaust are everywhere, and it's not just comedians who are telling these jokes. And again, and you'll hear me say this a number of times, the big question is why? Why joke about the Holocaust? Why do it to the extent that people are doing it? And why do it now? To understand why, you need to understand two things. The first is the question of why we, in fact, laugh, and the second would be the question of what is the history of Holocaust humor. A number of philosophers have weighed in on this big question. I laugh, therefore I am, right? Humor is a very definitive characteristic of what it means to be human. Animals don't laugh. They do all sorts of things. My dog is very sad when I'm gone, but he doesn't laugh. Only humans laugh. I laugh, therefore I am. Laughter has no greater foe than emotion, said Henri Bergson. Charles Baudelaire, laughter and tears are equally the children of woe, right? We laugh not necessarily because we're happy, not necessarily because we think something is funny or even comedic. Sometimes we laugh because there's a tragedy. Sometimes we laugh because we're uncomfortable. Sometimes we laugh to let off pent-up steam. Sometimes we laugh or we tell jokes as a way to resist or defy something. Finally, the question of restraint to release. In the wake of a collective tragedy, we feel restraint. We feel a very anxious kind of restraint, and we want to transition to a giddy release, right? How do we do that? We laugh. But the next question is, what happens when we can't joke about the subject matter from which we desire release? Now, unfortunately, you didn't get to see Jeffrey Ross in the clip of the roast from David Hasselhoff, but I did, after watching the roast, ask Jeffrey Ross to come to a class I was teaching at UCLA called The Holocaust in Film and Literature. So, Jeff Ross came, he talked to all 120 of my students about the nature and the ethics of comedy in a post-9/11 world, especially with regard to jokes about the Holocaust. But one of the most moving stories that Jeffrey Ross recounted was the story of how in the immediate, I mean the same day, aftermath of 9/11, Jeffrey Ross was in the city, he didn't know what to do, he went out, he got a bunch of sandwiches, because what else do you do when there's a big tragedy? You buy sandwiches. He bought his sandwiches, he goes home, and who does he see on his doorstep but none other than the comic Dave Chappelle and his family? They were covered in ash. They were silenced. They were unable to make jokes. All of a sudden, these comedic powerhouses were silenced, right? This is what 9/11 did. This is what the tragedy did. They didn't know how to make jokes about it. Not only did they not know how to make jokes about it, but they didn't see a future where they would ever be able to make jokes about it. And yet, we all still need to laugh. So how do we do that? And the big question is, why do we laugh now? One of the reasons that we continue to laugh at the Holocaust, at the expense of the Holocaust, is because we need a scapegoat, right? We can't joke about 9/11. It's too heavy, it's too loaded, it's too fraught, we're too uncomfortable, it's too awkward. We don't know how to talk about the subject matter without transgressing the memory of the victims. And so, what other material is there? What other big tragedy can we laugh about? The Holocaust. The Holocaust becomes a scapegoat. What we do is we replace one taboo with another, right? The Holocaust has long been a taboo, right? Never forget, and yet never will you know. And that means don't joke about the Holocaust. That means don't talk about it in any way that would even start to disrespect the victims. And yet now we're in an era where people joke about it, where all comics joke about it. So what has happened is that we've replaced one taboo with another. But to understand why that is, you need to understand the nature of trauma. If you've ever been in a car accident, and maybe some of you have, maybe some of you haven't, but let's say you've been in a car accident and you go through the windshield and you miraculously survive. You can never, okay, if somebody asks you after the fact, well, what was it like to go through the windshield? You can never recall the moment of trauma, right? Because it's fragmented. It's full of shards, literally and physically, right? You can't remember. So what happens is you revert to things that preceded the trauma, and you revert to things that follow the trauma. But you can never access the site of the trauma. So what happens with the issue of 9/11 is we've got a collective trauma. We're still in it. The events of 9/11, yes, they happened, but this is an ongoing trauma. We're still in it. We're still in the fallout, and we don't know how to deal with it. And yet we need to laugh. So what do we laugh about? The Holocaust. So then the question is anyone telling jokes about 9/11? And of course, there are comedians who are telling jokes about 9/11. Louis C.K. has told a really, I think, awful joke about 9/11 about masturbating in between the two towers going down. Gilbert Gottfried, of course, has famously told a very, very inappropriate joke. Mark Maron was asked about, the comedian Mark Maron was asked about this issue of 9/11 in the context of comedy, and he said, it actually came up on stage the other night. I'd done a setup to a joke where I say, I almost killed 2 people, and there's no reason to laugh there, but some woman, stage right, just started laughing. I'm like, what's wrong with you? I mean, there's no joke there. Is it just funny, the idea that I almost kill people? And somehow I built on it to the point where I got the Holocaust involved. I said, is that funny to you? And then people were still laughing because I was attacking this woman. And then when I said 9/11, it was like, whoa, whoa. So basically, I think what Mark Maron meant to say at the end of my slide was that it does represent a kind of cultural sensitivity to a very large traumatic issue. We're not quite ready to joke about it, and yet we're ready to joke about something. And if 9/11 is off limits, the Holocaust, well, fair game, right? So, the next question is, how do we do what Jews do best? And there are 2 things that Jews do really, really well. I think the first thing has to do with ethics, with responsibility, with questioning what is my responsibility as a Jew, and I think the second thing is laughter, right? So the question then is there a responsibility to laugh? Do we have a responsibility to laugh at Hitler? What happens when people are laughing at victims? How do we draw these kinds of lines, these kind of boundaries? How do we find a balance between the scapegoat impulse and responsibility? Which leads me to a very important point, which is this idea of ridicule, right? Mel Brooks, as well as Jeffrey Ross in my classroom at UCLA, suggested that Holocaust humor works when you're ridiculing Hitler, right? But when you're mocking victims, okay, when your comedic exploit comes at the expense of victims, you're committing a transgression. Okay, so what we can do is ask the right questions. Some of you found the jokes that Zach read funny. Okay, I found some of them funny. Some of you didn't find all of them or some of them funny. Okay, humor is subjective. We all create our own boundaries. We create our own lines. It's always already subjective. So all we can do, if we want to be on the same page, is to ask the right questions. Can Holocaust humor ever be funny, or is it always necessarily inappropriate? Who has the right to tell Holocaust jokes? Jews? Can any Jew tell a Holocaust joke? Can a non-Jew tell a Holocaust joke? Lisa Lampanelli, not a Jew. She told a Holocaust joke at the expense of victims. Is that funny? My gut says no, but you might disagree. Jeffrey Ross, a big Jew. he told a funny joke. But the second part of it, I don't know if it was so funny. Does he have the right to tell a joke that's not funny because he's Jewish? I don't have the answers, but I think the important thing is that we ask the questions. Speaking of ridicule, it's not so easy to tell when somebody is ridiculing Hitler. Mel Brooks has said, I think he said in an interview in the late 60s about the producers, the reason he created the film was to ridicule Hitler. When you ridicule Hitler, you bring him down, right? So here is Roseanne Barr. This was on the cover of Hebe magazine, a Jewish publication, very edgy, border-pushing publication a few years ago. Roseanne Barr is depicted as Hitler, and she's got a tray of burnt cookies. Funny or not funny? I don't have a final answer, but I have a problem with this because it's not clear to me that Hitler is being ridiculed. I sense that there might be some ridicule at the expense of victims. But again, this is about a dialogue. This is about questioning the impulses, the intentions of these comedic impulses. This is what it looks like to ridicule Hitler, right? Very clear, on the left, kick me. Looks like an idiot. On the right, with the red nose. Very clearly making fun of Hitler, right? But back to the roast of David Hasselhoff. When Jeffrey Ross said, finally, a Jew gets to roast a German, the only difference between Hasselhoff and Hitler, at least Hitler knew when his career was over. Oh, why did the Germans love you so much? Maybe because it should fill the entertainment void left by Anne Frank. The first part is funny, I think, right? How many think the first part is funny? The only difference between Hasselhoff and Hitler, at least Hitler knew when his career was over. How many think that's funny? Show of hands. My eyes are becoming accustomed to the light and I can see you. Okay, so I see some hands. How many don't think it's funny? First part. Okay, some people don't think it's funny. But we're laughing, okay? When you hear it, you laugh before you get a chance to evaluate whether or not you really think it's funny and whether or not you really think it's ethical. But before we can even assess whether it's funny or not funny, he's on to the second part of the joke. Why do the Germans love you so much? Maybe it's because you feel the entertainment void left by Anne Frank. How many think the second part is funny? Some people. How many don't like the second part? How many feel a little bit uncomfortable? Okay, and it's because he's talking about a victim in this sense, okay? So this is where it starts to get a little bit fuzzy. He later said in the roast, but I also heard this. I also heard Jerry Springer's mother and father are Holocaust survivors, which is amazing. But I got to admit, as a Jew, it's the only time I ever wished, why couldn't they have killed 6 million in 2? Too soon? Too soon? Too obvious? Too bad, fuck it. Funny? I don't know. This was not aired. They chose not to air this in the version that we saw on television, but it was in the transcript, so I read it. And when Jeffrey Ross came to my class, he explained that Jerry Springer was livid. But then they had a conversation, and Jerry Springer ended up saying, okay, I guess I get where you were going with it, and I respect you. But again, this is something that has to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. Seth MacFarlane. David is a terrible singer, the only singer in history whose auto-tune just said, fuck it. But in Europe, the man is huge. The Germans think David Hasselhoff is just gewaltig, which translates to dead Jew-tastic. That's right. In Germany, a ticket to a Hasselhoff concert only costs 40,000 pairs of old eyeglasses. Funny, not funny. A little uncomfortable, right? How many of you feel uncomfortable? It's a little bit uncomfortable. How many of you have seen the images of the piles of thousands and thousands of eyeglasses? It's hard to laugh in the face of a pile of eyeglasses, right? And again, the Lisa Lampanelli, it's at the cost of victims, so it's very hard to laugh. We laugh, and then we feel guilty, if you have a conscience. Gilbert Gottfried, this one's a little bit more ambiguous. And one of the standards that I've kind of set for myself in terms of what's funny and what's not funny is, would a Holocaust denier, would an anti-Semite, somebody who demonstrates anti-Semitic impulses, would they feel validation from this joke? And if they would, then maybe it's not appropriate. The question then is, what is appropriate? Is there an ethical way to joke about Hitler? And one of the best examples that I can give you would be from Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator film that he made in 1940. He had to finance this film all on his own because no filmmaker, no producer, no studio in Hollywood wanted to touch it, right? So he believed in this enough to where he put all of his money behind it, and I think that the result is stunning.
Leave me. I want to be alone. Out Caesar, out Nolus, Emperor of the world. My word.
This is actually one of the most famous scenes in cinematic history, not necessarily with regard to films about the Holocaust, but just in cinematic history in general. And it's a beautiful scene. It's funny. He's elegant. He's graceful. He's funny. But he's also ridiculing Hitler. At the end of this scene, and I'm not showing it because it's too long, the globe actually bursts. And then Charlie Chaplin, playing Hitler, laughs this very, very, very maniacal laugh. And there's something very terrifying about this. It's funny, but it also packs a punch, right? This is a film about, this is a scene about a madman who actually had the world in his hands. So while we laugh at it, we also have to realize the reality of the situation. So I think that well, to make a long story short, I think that laughter can be a way into or back into ethical responsibility, and perhaps humor, perhaps even Holocaust humor, is the tool to help us get there. Thank you.